Hi, everyone. Welcome to an episode of Trident Talks. I'm Josh, the co-founder here at Trident, and today, very happy to say I'm joined by Adam Winter, operator and investor. Adam, thanks for joining.
Hey, thanks, Josh. Good to be here.
No problem at all. Adam, as we kind of discussed before, we're launching a new series throughout the next couple of months, and these episodes will be kind of based around taking your advice, having your background in sales and as an investor and kind of seeing or being part of huge scale-ups within cyber and tech. What considerations do I have to take into account if I'm going to open up a new territory, regardless of what the demand is and the reason behind the kind of launch into that new territory? I'd love to know kind of like what the kind of considerations and what we need to kind of take into account, and also what mistakes to avoid and bits like that. But firstly, did you want to kind of give everyone a bit of an introduction as to what your background is and kind of where you're at now?
Sure. So it's Adam Winter. I started my career at Cisco when it was a starter in 1996. So I'm showing my age a little bit. I did over a decade at Cisco. I started in the UK, and then I went around the world in various different sales, individual contributor roles, all the way to the lofty heights of managing directors and that type of thing, and managing teams with Cisco. Worked with them in the Middle East, set their region up over there. And then since really kind of the end of Cisco, I've been getting earlier and earlier into tech startups, and now just do really Series A seed in cyber AI, and typically take an investor operator position where I assume a senior sales role, and really kind of get them to that first 10 million of annual recurring revenue, and then exit. That's been the sweet spot over the last kind of 4 or 5 years.
Nice, awesome, great spot to be in. Do you help the existing CROs, if they have one, or VP of sales, to rebuild a go-to-market strategy, or do you put a new one in place for them, or is it more a case of making introductions to people that you know in the industry, or a bit of both? How does it work?
Yeah, so there's so with when startups start, they don't really need a sales team because the founders are the sales team.
Yeah,
and that kind of first, but it's quite a nervous thing to do if you're the founder. You're very passionate about the problem you're trying to solve, and you are the company. It's still really an idea at that point. You're trying to find those visionary customers in markets. And then the question that everybody rattles around when they raise a Series A, or they're just about to raise a Series A, is what are you going to go spend the money on? And typically the mistake is to hire too senior sales leader too early, because you can't scale something that doesn't have metrics and is a real problem for that kind of next wave. So there tends to be a view of kind of what do you do? How do you move beyond founder-led sales with somebody with experience and knowledge to do that, that doesn't want to necessarily have that big lofty ambition of growing a team of 50 people. And typically that's the sweet spot that I found that I kind of really can help, is really that movement from founder-led sales to a more generic sales organization that can take the core learnings and really get it to that. I wouldn't say it's kind of a scale out stage, but really kind of go from visionary customers to early adopters would be, typically the challenge that I'd get involved in.
Okay, awesome, nice. So bringing it back to kind of expanding new territories, and you mentioned a point then. You've just the scenario could be a founder has just raised Series A. We've got $15 million VC in the US, as an example, or wherever they may be focused. And part of that investment is you must now open up new territories. It might be a bit too early if it's Series A, right? But it might be more a case of proof of concepts and stuff. But let's say part of that investment is to build out a sales team in a particular location. Have you got any kind of, or can you think back to any examples or kind of times when you have done it in the past and kind of what you had to put into place first and the kind of the considerations for that?
Yeah, there's lots of that. I mean, there's so many examples of wasted effort and money that has gone in. I mean, the last Series A I was involved in, you end up spending a ton of money figuring out what not to do. And that's just unfortunately what it is. There's a huge amount of trial and error in the go-to-market that needs to kind of get thrown into it. And so but you can solve a lot of those problems by being a little bit more clear-eyed typically, I think one of the biggest mistakes that early stage companies or founders make is they haven't proven the value that they're selling. So if you think about any problem that's being solved, and I've always joked that desperate people buy from startups, because if you weren't desperate, you would probably buy from your existing suppliers. To onboard a new vendor is difficult, right? You've got to go through all various different, hoops and hurdles to get it. And so if somebody that's already in your stack can solve that problem, then you're probably not going to reach out to a starter. So I think, first of all, it's just been cleary-eyed with kind of how urgent and compelling is this problem to solve. And that tends to vary by geography and industry. So that's just, who are we solving it for? Why is it urgent? Why is it painful? So that kind of initial ideal customer profile is typically not thought of. They think this problem just exists everywhere, but it typically isn't. If you're in a one sector, it might not appeal to another industry. It might not be in another geography. I think that's key. And then I think the second big mistake that I find that founders make is that although they might get some visionary customers to adopt the platform or the offer early, they're not clear enough in collecting the metrics that sit behind having solved that problem for that customer. Mm-hmm. So when you bring in a sales organization, how do you scale relationships? Well, it's very difficult. But if you've been able to solve a problem and record how you've solved it and the metrics that you were able to achieve with that client, it's quite easy to kind of grab that and then really scale it. And I just find it's just amazing how many founder CEOs just want to do everything for their customers, but don't ask them the basics about, well, what was the end result of what we did? What did we solve? Did we reduce your risk? Did we save you money? Did we make you money? What was the ultimate business case that we were able to achieve? And I often find that they're just missing on those metrics in the early stages.
Is that because a founder is so kind of forward thinking and so like almost blinkers on because they're like, my product is amazing. It's my baby. It's so good. People are going to keep buying it because our brand's amazing. Marketing's great. We're at events. We're spending money. I'm just trying to understand that without an advisor to go, hey, let me just kind of walk you through this and just show you what it could look like in a year if we do not put these steps in place. I can imagine a lot of the time you get very kind of single-minded founders, which is why they're probably so sort of eventually successful as entrepreneurs. But why would they not think about them? Like I don't know, just talking out loud. Let's go back to the metric point, right? How do I identify a metric that from a POC all the way through to them kind of like after the first year, for example, let's just say it's that long. How do I identify that metric from day one? Is it just asking the right questions from the company to say, hey, what are your pain points right now? Is it the risk? Is it the cost? Is it the revenue generating? And then go, okay, cool. Our product can fix that one. Let's track that metric all the way through.
Yeah, and I think it's all that, John. I think there's certainly a lot of technical knowledge that goes into it, and that ability to kind of, if you think about visionary people that have particular pain points, they're ultimately having to sell whatever it is you're selling to them to somebody else within the business. And it's that conversation. It's the conversation behind the conversation. So if typically in startups, there's a technical issue that can't be solved with existing solutions, and so the person that's buying it is quite deeply rooted in that problem statement, but they would have to be making a business case to somebody somewhere else in the business. And I find that founders don't ask that question because they're so fixated on that initial entry point of the organization. They're kind of giddy with excitement that someone, I guess it's like geeking out on the technical problem, right? And so it's like, well, how are you selling this within the business? Just some of those basics. And the sad reality is that person will probably tell you, but you have to be asking the question up front. And I just find founders don't do it for whatever reason. I think it's, I don't know. It just seems to be consistent.
Yeah. So to make that clear, is your sponsor, let's say, is the technical person the founder is talking to and having that geeking out conversation, let's say, for example, and getting really deep into the weeds. It's they then go internally to a, let's say, CFO, let's just say. And it's like, well, they have to be selling your kind of your product market fit or what metric you're kind of solving for them or problem. And then the CFO goes, oh, that makes sense. That's worth onboarding them. That's worth going through the pain of procurement, because that does make sense, because you come to me with that pain point, they can fix it. Not they are the new AI XDR tool that's going to make me want to rip out my current XDR that expires in 4 weeks. And it's kind of like, it has to be so much better. Like when really, what are you, 1% better, 5% better? CISOs are not going to go through that effort, right? Or whoever the sponsor is to go, well, it's worth ripping out. So yeah, pinpointing a metric or a specific kind of pain point that they can go to the secondary person, I suppose, who typically is the budget holder, right? I'm guessing, or secondary budget holder.
Yeah, it's funny. I think there's just an aversion to talk to the business generally. But actually selling to the business is easier than selling to a technical person, because businesses are really, as you know, right, you've set your own company up and, very successfully. You really only care about how much money you're making, how much it's costing you to make it, how you're making your customers happy so they continue to grow with you, and how much risk you're running with. I mean, I know you're opening up a new venture in the US. I mean, there's cost, there's risk. So coming to you to talk about how to reduce your cost, increase your chance of success and reduce your risk is a pretty easy conversation to have. And if your technical solution, if whatever you're selling, if it's a cyber product, it's like, well, how does that help, Josh expand his business in the US, if that's the driver, right? How does it help you reduce your risk as a CEO of this company? If you can link, and there was a famous phrase that I got taught at Cisco that's always stuck with me, which is, unless you can identify yourself on a customer's balance sheet, if you're selling anything, unless you can identify it on their balance sheet, be it their profit and loss or their income statement, then you're irrelevant. And it's not a bad way to think about your problem statement. It's like, if I was successful with this customer, how would I identify myself on their balance sheet? So if I take, for example, cyber risk, which is the last thing that I've been, well, and still are deeply involved in, most companies disclose what their material cyber risks are on their shareholders agreements, on their public disclosures, on maybe their insurance premiums and so forth. So I guess if you were selling a cyber risk product in a year's time, how did you materially reflect those disclosures? At some point, the company would say, look, we've been able to improve our risk position by X to Y, which has resulted in us being able to drop our cyber insurance premium by Z. That's a material benefit to the business. And I think, just being able to track what is it the problem all the way through to the balance sheet is a useful just head thing to think about. In a year, if we carry on down this road, how would that company report what we've done? Where would it show up on? Because ultimately, you run a P&L, at some point you put a bunch of numbers together and there's a bunch of inputs to that number. If you're one of those inputs and it's reduced risk or improved revenue or, taken cost out of, and you can say, that's what I did, then you're onto something.
Yeah, that's a really good way to visualize it. And I never really thought of it like that, where I put it in my shoes. It's at the end of the month, my client might be talking to their CFO, if they are the founder, whoever it may be. And it's, Trident cost us this month. Why? What value did they bring? Are they worth spending the same amount next month? Right? That's the be all end all of what value did it bring? Can we get it cheaper? Can they reduce time to hire or whatever it may be? Can someone else do it faster or slower or whatever suits that business? But yeah, if you see yourself as a kind of an item line on a P&L, then it suddenly becomes really real that you have to then be providing such value or solving a problem. Revenue.
I mean, it's a great example, right? Because if you're selling to a cybersecurity startup organization, a sales guy, and in a year's time, that sales guy has produced $5 million worth of annual recurring revenue on a target of 2. You can say, look, that's our impact in your revenue statement directly. If you're recruiting for a SOC analyst, and that SOC analyst knocked it out of the park and was able to reduce the amount of alerts to whatever the metric is that's being tracked by that business in a more timely fashion, then you can directly point to the fact that that's the impact that you've had on that business. And so It's actually quite a simple concept, but it's interesting how few people do it. But if you go to your sponsor for any project, if you go to your champion or your coach, whoever's kind of leaning in for you on that deal, and you ask them that question, where did our product or service show up on your balance sheet? They'll help you. They'll actually tell you where it is, right? And that's beneficial from two levels. One, you can repeat that. So when you go to sell to the next client, you can say, well, on a previous engagement, we were able to reduce cost, increase revenue, or reduce risk in these ways. But it also keeps you very sticky with that client, because ultimately, why would they get rid of somebody that's improving, the fortunes of that business?
Yeah, it's really helpful for a customer success team when you're looking at retentions, upsells, etc. Right, to really visualize and get inside the P&L almost. Just a few quick fire questions, Adam. Just around opening up new territories and expansions. Have you seen many or any examples or kind of not failures, but any successes, or either really, around kind of not adapting to or not adopting the culture? So you could say an Israeli firm moving into the US, a US company moving into Eastern Europe, whatever it may be, right? Comes using classic examples. Do you see, is that taken into account when the founder is going for investment? You've been sat in front of pitches and stuff. Do people talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's huge cultural differences. I mean, the US is very lucky in that it's just one geography with one language. Although I would argue that if you travel around the US, I think they're very different countries, like within one country. But they tend to be reasonably similar in the way that they look at business comparatively to other parts in the world. But Europe is very complicated for the US, because historically the way it's worked is the UK and Scandinavia has been where you would go as an early stage tech startup, because they tend to be the more innovative regions. Also, English is spoken widely in the Scandinavian and obviously UK. So typically what happened was that you would go, right, we'll go Northern Europe, then we'll go Germany, DACH region, then we'll go Southern Europe, right? And why is that? Well, it just tends to be kind of how it's played out in Europe. I don't necessarily think that's so true today. We can kind of get into that. And then I think so that's kind of Europe, but then then they bunch Middle East and Africa together, which having lived in the Middle East for 6.5 years, is a weird concept, because South Africa is more like UK, the UAE and Saudi and Qatar, and they're all very, and you have to be in those regions to do well, and it's quite an expensive undertaking to get there, and government tends to be a bigger conversation than private sector, and so on and so forth, and so it is quite nuanced. And I do find, having been like a Brit with quite a lot of European, Middle East and African experience, that trying to explain this to a US-centered organization is difficult if that person hasn't worked internationally in that regard. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
it does. Yeah. It's just interesting to see when I look back at some organizations that went into a region and then have withdrawn. Whether that is because they didn't quite adopt the cultural differences, I'm not sure that's the case. It could be economic issues, political, it could be anything, geopolitical, anything, right? Next question then. So do you believe it's possible? The scenario is, I've just received funding. Part of that is to expand into a region. Is it possible to keep my sales and marketing centralized in my current location? Let's say the Brits, and we want to move to the US and we want to start targeting East Coast. I'm thinking of like the kind of, even just as basic as the spelling on documents, right? To make it very obvious you're British and not American. Can you, I suppose it was a bit of a loaded question, but can you be successful having like a centralized marketing team? Ideally, your VP of sales first will be boots on the ground, but can that happen?
I don't think it works very well. And let me get in. So the tendency for, let's pick on the US startups. The US like to build centrally and export. That's kind of in their DNA. So they tend to recruit VPs of marketing, and those VPs of marketing try to run global campaigns. They'll recruit VPs of sales. Those salespeople will try to run global campaigns. But I find that the message doesn't really work that well in kind of countries outside of North America, that especially in the early stages, when in reality getting your message across is quite difficult to amplify into a market. And what I've tried to kind of advise and lead in international expansion is very much like a pod mentality. So if you're going to go into a geography or a vertical, to very much hire, an SDR, a sales, and an SE stroke customer success, hopefully the combo, and really drop them as a kind of SEAL Team 6 unit into the region, and really to kind of step away from saying let's landline everything and we'll put one sales guy on his own in Amsterdam, and he's constantly trying to get messages and rewrite PDFs and all that sort of stuff, and say, look, we're gonna do it as a pod. It's like these 3 tiers of an SE, and I tend to find that the systems engineer is better if they can sit post and pre-sales.
Yep.
A sales guy that SEALs Team 6 is quite a good example, because you really want to give somebody 3 days of food, a bit like you're ex-military. You want a sales guy that you can give 3 days of food and he comes back 3 weeks later, right? It's you have to kind of throw, and look, I'm going to give you an SDR, I'm going to give you an SA, and I'm going to give you 3 days of food, go figure it out. And those are the types of models that I think work really well, because they'll figure it out if you give them the latitude. But if you're trying to, take a message and just scale it and say that this works in North America, just run with it, then what tends to happen is that it underwhelms. So it worked. Obviously the US market is huge, and it's quite, what works in California kind of works in New York, right? So, but it might not necessarily work in Finland or in the Nordic region or in Northern Europe. And so there's that kind of, I would say, is probably a better strategy to think about a pod mentality when you go international.
Yeah, I've seen that quite common. It's been quite common. US businesses entering the European market, and they drop a VP of sales, an SDR, and an SE, and say, figure it out. And it works best when the VP of sales is like an entrepreneurial kind of spirited animal who can kind of, I'll make it work. I'll hustle. I'll use what I've got with limited resources, and I'll just figure it out. And I'll come back to you at the end of the year with 1.4 million done in the first year. And you're like, great. And they're very resourceful, should we say. Adam.
Yeah. And the other thing is that, typically startups have lots and lots of good advisors with them, right? They're typically made up of, if it's a decent startup that's attracted decent capital, there'll be lots of very influential people that will be attached to that company. And so if you drop a kind of a pod into a region, it's quite easy to kind of connect various different relationships together. And if that team is empowered and say, look, I'm going to help you get the types of meetings that you want to get, but you've got to run the play, you've got to run the execution. Those are the types of people you want to hire. And when you, because the problem is that when you recruit for early stage companies, a lot of companies that have never done it, a lot of people that have never done it in big companies just can't handle that type of responsibility. And it's a good test of whether the people are the right people. It's like, look, I'm going to give you 3 days of food and come back 3 weeks and tell me what the plan is. Some people rise to that challenge, and some people run a million miles from it. But if you too spoon-fed people, you end up recruiting the wrong people.
Adam, I just want to say thanks so much for your insight, all your experience, and bringing it kind of to the table for everyone else to kind of listen to and learn from. There's a few key takeaways there, which I'll kind of wrap up into the info bit at the bottom of the YouTube video. In particular, the kind of visualizing yourself in a P&L as a line item is really, really key. And I think that's a big takeaway for everybody to kind of, even as an SDR, right, let alone a founder of a vendor. So, yeah, I really appreciate your time. It's been great having you on. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Well, good luck, and yeah, great to be on the YouTube. Cheers, Josh. Take care.
Thanks, Adam.